Hi everybody, in this review of Ruth Wariner's The Sound of Gravel, I will be talking about the content and thematic concerns in the memoir, but not any major spoilers. But if you don't want to hear anything about what happens in the book at all, now would be a good time to press pause and go and read it right away. This is a memoir of a woman named Ruth Wariner who grew up in a polygamist colony in Mexico, in Chihuahua, Mexico, which is kind of like, it's the state on the border of Mexico, and she's kind of like in the middle of Chihuahua. I know this because as a kid, I spent every Christmas from when I was about 12 years old till I was about 22 years old, I think, maybe 23. We would go down to a place called Colonial Juarez in Chihuahua, Mexico, which is just a few miles away from the colony where this woman grew up, which was called LeBaron. So we would drive past LeBaron all the time, and I would see this colony and talk to my parents about, what was going on there. It was like a very notorious polygamous colony. The people who lived there were part of an offshoot of fundamental Mormonism who taught that their leader was like a new prophet who was bringing Joseph Smith's true teachings back to the people so that they can kind of like secure themselves against the coming apocalypse in America. America is like this land of just like supreme evil. So they all escaped to Colonia LeBaron and set up a very poor, destitute kind of situation down there. So Ruth Wariner grows up in this community. She is the daughter of the prophet of LeBaron. Her grandfather had been converted to this polygamist cult and moved his family down to Chihuahua, and his daughter, so Ruth's mother, married the prophet of the church, one of his many, many wives, and had a few kids with him. She was so starved for nutritional food that her first two children by this man were mentally handicapped, and then she had Ruth, and then I'm probably missing a few kids in here because there are a million kids. And then the prophet dies and she marries another man who also has multiple wives and continues to have children. Ruth grows up then extremely poor. Her house doesn't have running water, it doesn't have electricity, it doesn't have a working bathroom or a working shower. Her stepfather is just a horrible man, as you would expect, and he just didn't care about his family at all. And in the memoir, she describes how hard it is growing up that poor. The little things that you take for granted that she had to deal with in like really complicated, tedious ways. Just taking a bath becomes like this hardship. And her mom has so many children that Ruth becomes responsible as both a child to her mother and as a mother to her siblings, which is common thing that happens in polygamist families because there are just too many children and not enough adults around. So I thought Wariner did a really good job with this memoir considering the circumstances. She didn't get to have a very continuous educational experience. She was constantly caring for siblings. She had to put her own personal development and education aside to help her family. And considering that, when you read this memoir, it is pretty incredible what she has accomplished here. I don't think that it's perfect writing, but I think, like the Louis Armstrong memoir that I read last year, I think that she does the best with what she has, and what she has is pretty brilliant and incredible. The story itself is just like enormously compelling. I couldn't put it down. I literally couldn't put it down. I was reading this all day. It was amazing, and there are a lot of things that happen in it that you are just blown away. You're going to be just devastated for her and her family. And she does a really good job of detailing how her life unfolded. There are no points in the story where you feel like she left information out or isn't being completely honest with the reader, which is something that is really tough to do in a memoir. You have to understand what your reader is going to find interesting and compelling, and then you have to regurgitate that through your memories. That said, there is some weirdness with the memories because she uses a lot of spoken dialogue, but from when she was 3-4 years old. So you know that she didn't remember it that way. And in fact, could she have even remembered that conversation taking place? She does mention that she talked to her older siblings about it, but I just don't think that anybody could reconstruct conversations in the way that she does. And there is never any acknowledgement that it's a reconstruction in that way. Sometimes what happens is the dialogue seems so on point that it feels really unnatural, and I start to be like a little suspicious of it. But as you get used to that, you start accepting the book for what it is. There was some really weird stuff in this book though that I just couldn't understand really where she was coming from. Part of that is because she comes from someplace so completely different from where I come from. She has this experience in polygamy where she was completely isolated throughout her childhood. She only really interacted with members of her family, because in polygamist colonies, everybody is a member of your family. And so when she talks about her story, she talks about how hard it was to be poor, and she mentions things like, isn't it crazy that our house wasn't wired for electricity, or that our shower was shocking us? Isn't that nuts? And to me, that part, yeah, that's pretty crazy, and I'm really sorry that you had to undergo this painful hardship of being poor. But I also know people that have had that experience. I do not know people who have grown up in polygamy. That's the strange part to me. And so for her to kind of normalize the religion was a very interesting move. It made the memoir more interesting to read, even though by the end I was extremely frustrated with her for not being angrier at her religion itself. I wanted her to point out the misogyny in her religion, and misogynistic things continue to happen to her, and she never really points out that the reason these things are happening is because it's a culture that devalues women and puts all of their value on men. There was a little bit of that, and you could obviously pick it out for yourself, but it just felt like there was a layer of it that she was unaware of because of that normalizing of the religion, which came across as really creepy, actually. She has overcome so much, but there's still that element of brainwashing there that she probably could never escape. I think like all of us can never escape our personal experiences. And in that way, I felt like she was too forgiving. A lot of times memoirs focus on forgiveness, these hard things that you experienced in your life, but you're moving past it and you understand where the people in your life are coming from. And I get that. I get that impulse, and it's got to be healing for the writer, but I felt like she was too forgiving of everyone in her life. Too forgiving of the culture itself that produced her. It's a cult. It's a real cult. And she kind of acts like, oh, it's okay what people decide to do, it just wasn't for me. That's a little bit minimizing what her experience was, obviously, but I did get that feeling from her in the end, that it wasn't an attack on polygamy itself, it was an attack on her personal situation in polygamy, which is frustrating to me. I think there is value in empathy, especially in a memoir where the author is trying to understand where the people in her life came from and kind of trying to move forward from that. But I also think there's a lot of value in anger and in hatred, where you can hate some things that this culture represents without hating every single person that is involved in that culture. I wish I could talk about more, but I really don't want to give spoilers. So if you've read this book already, I know it came out January 5th. I was just extremely interested in it because I have this personal connection to the place. But if you have read this book already, I would really love to talk to you about it. I am dying to talk to somebody about this book because just so many insane things happen in it, and they are interpreted in such an unusual way that I have a lot to say. So yeah, leave me a comment below. Let me know what you thought or what you're thinking about these things. Again, the book is called The Sound of Gravel, a memoir by Ruth Wariner, and I would highly recommend it just as a thought experiment and an emotional aesthetic experience that you can have from reading about another person's experience. I thought it was very fascinating.